I want to welcome everyone to our History at Noon program. We're in October already. The fall colors are changing, and we're still having good weather. Unless you're looking at tomorrow's forecast, we're supposed to be quite rainy. But welcome again to History at Noon. I am Tom LeClaire. I am the town and village historian. Most of you probably know that by now, but for those that are new to today's program. This program is brought to you by the Historian's Office, Thousand Islands Museum, the Sesquicentennial Historic Committee, and the Clayton Opera House. We're working together to bring you these great programs. Today we got Dean Wilkie from Depauville. Early in the year I had asked the Depauville Free Library to take on one of the programs. Clayton cannot celebrate its sesquicentennial without having Depauville part of the program. We are interconnected, and there's a lot of good things that have happened in Clayton, thankfully to the folks at Depauville. And Dean today is probably going to touch on a few of those. I do not know what he's going to be sharing, but I would imagine that, again, some of that will come out. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Dean.
Thank you, Tom. First thing, I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for your interest in today's topic. And then the next thing I'm going to say to you is, I want you to either stare at the ceiling or close your eyes and just sit and listen as I read the way the description of the settlement of Depauville was written in an early Jefferson County history. The Hamlet. Nestled in a scenic little hollow where several hills tumble together. These hills, of a trackless wilderness, are densely clad with beech, elm, maple, oak, walnut, and basswood. A shimmering creek winds its way among the hills and trees, rolling along, tumbling over the rocks, and creating an impressive waterfall and cataracts as it becomes the Chaumont River, wending its way along peacefully among the hills, flowing southwest to mingle with the waters of Chaumont Bay and Lake Ontario. That's the way they chose to describe the settlement of Depauville. Somebody was a terrific romantic, but having grown up there, it certainly does have its moments. And this time of year, as Tom was just telling, and it was particularly true before they cut the hill that made the difference. But you used to drive from Clayton into Depauville, and as you drove down the hill, the picture with the two church steeples and the one stone church in the background and all the fall color graced the Watertown newspaper multiple times and was often seen in other picture publications. Depauville, as it is now called, was situated at the head of navigation, where the waterfalls created then Catfish Falls. Why Catfish Falls? Well, it speaks for itself. The fish life was plentiful in the waters at that time. And I'll take and add this in because they were discussing it. The communities that started around water power had an advantage in the beginning. And so you had communities like Teresa was at that time known as High Falls. Carthage was Long Falls. And Depauville was Catfish Falls. And Burville was just being talked about. These communities had an advantage in the beginning because of the water power. The water power was absolutely necessary to the life of an early settlement. So they started out definitely having a big advantage. And as we go on, I will point out what was the slow, gradual decline or death, if you will, of the village of Depauville. Now, the earliest inhabitants of Catfish Falls were members of the Iroquois Nation. That was, in particular, the Oneida Nation. They owned the property as much as an Indian nation owns property, but it was their holding, and on the top of the hill, there is evidence of a longhouse that stood there for years. And in I should have wrote that down. I'm going to say late 60s, maybe early 70s. One of the universities from up north came and did an archaeological dig. I went watched and watched and watched, and as the season wound down, and the college kids had to go back to college, one day one of the professors up there said, "Kid, you've watched us all summer. You know what to do." And he handed me a brush and a trowel, and I like to often tell people that the skeletal remains that I worked on was the first woman I really dug. I can almost keep up with you. Many of the reasons that it was an ideal location for a settlement, not only for the Indian tribes, but also for early settlers, would be the fact that fish was plentiful, game was plentiful in the forest, there was berries and nuts in the woods, there was the hills that offered protection and from winter storms and the winds. And so once you got nestled down in there, it was a real cozy place to be. And then there was the water power. So it was also at that time a crossroad for trading trails, Indian trading trails with the early settlers of the day. Then also the other thing that it was notorious for was they would canoe upriver to, I think they probably went as far as they could into French Creek. Then they would portage to Chaumont River, just below the falls. And then they could go directly to the lake. And to me, it seems like that was a laborious way to get there, but it cut miles off from an all-water route from this point out and around the cape and then down through the lake, especially if you were paddling against a strong headwind. So that's this other, if it was a portage point. In 1788, the Oneida Nation and the Confederacy of the Indian Nations ceded the land north of the Oneida Lake to a young, mind you, 1788, we had barely been a nation long, but that it was ceded over to the U.S. government, stipulating at that time that a 10 square mile area of his choosing would be deeded over to Pinay, Pierre Pinay. There's a placard outside the village, I think, giving him recognition. It was to be given to him for work that he had done to help the Indian Nation. The government did recognize the claim, and there was some dissension there, but they did recognize it. They granted him title to the tract of land of his choosing, and Pierre Pinay, a Frenchman, became the first white man to hold a legal title in his territory. Let's talk about Peter Pinay. Great man of history. You can't drive around our area without hearing about Pinay Square. From the history of Pinay Square, a brief sketch of the life and character and operations of Peter Pinay, published in 1905, he is described as an adventurer, a speculator, unscrupulous in conduct, of inordinate vanity, a great liar, and a graceless rascal. Part of the reason for that description would be that he became familiar with one of the tribal chiefs and told and learned that the Indians placed great stock in dreams and visions. So he bargained for property by telling the chief that he had had a dream. And the chief gave him a vast tract of land. Well, the chief, not to be humiliated, honored what he said was his dream. So he got absolute free property out of the deal. Where do we first see the Frenchman? He was in the fall of 1788 at Fort Stanwix during the treaty process that began. He was the agent in Schenectady. He worked for the Indian Nation, but he also was working for the U.S. government. So he kind of was playing that both ways. He left there shortly after to get such sums as he could. He now owned property, so he was going to start out on a different venture. He sailed home to France in 1789 swindling of it, and yeah, really did no good, or not much good. Penny Square, the property chunk. You have to discuss some of this stuff so that we know what we're talking about. The land occupied and comprised, I got it here someplace, 640,000 acres of land in that transaction. Now, I like to say that this was the first successful I have a dream speech that was ever given. Okay? In nearly all the town of Orleans, half the town of Clayton, a small portion of the town of Pamelia falls within that 640,000 acres. Your early communities of that block of land would have been Clayton at French Creek, Catfish Falls, Log Mills in Fartsville, Omar, Orleans Corners, and Stone Mills. In 1818, John Lafarge of Lafargeville fame acquired the most of the acreage. He then in turn sold 15 lots to a capitalist and import merchant from New York City by the name of Francis Depauville. He too was a Frenchman. I'm going to get a little picky here. It's not DePaul or DePaul. It's Depauville. He was a Frenchman. And that's where Depauville gets its name. About Francis Depauville. Francis wasn't just any merchant. He basically was the son of the Lord Chamberlain to Louis XV. And prior to the French Revolution, he came over. The French Revolution took place in 1793, but he came over here to seek his fortune and to escape the collapse of the monarchy. And as we know from our other histories, the French invested heavily in northern New York. Some of it is French-Canadian, but a large import of it was just the Frenchmen coming to the North Country. They saw an untamed wilderness that they would create a new empire from. So Francis, or Franny, if you will, he married well, because he married Sylvia, the daughter of Count Francis de Grasse, who was the commander of the fleet at the Battle of Yorktown. Franny was ambitious, and he had immigrated so that he could make a fortune. And he did do fairly well. His father, when he imported here, and about the time he was investing in property, his father, the Lord Chamberlain, just as a sidebar, was escorting Marie Antoinette to Paris before the marriage to Louis XVI. Now, they had 5 daughters and 2 sons, and Mr. DePauw's daughter Amelia married Thaddeus Fowler of Fowler fame. Mr. Fowler Sr. bought and gifted to his daughter 36,000 acres for the newlyweds, and Francis DePauw, not to be undone, decided that he would build them a mansion on Lake Sylvia, and in 1829, the mansion cost him $17,000. Eliza, one of the other daughters, married Dr. Samuel Fox, who was a very early physician in the area. The DePauws, Francis and his wife, gave very generous sums to the building of churches, stores, schools, and even highways and bridges in the early days to get the community settled. And about some of the other children, this is where I take a page from Kier Penny, and I become unscrupulous. You can read more about it by buying a book. In 1817, the first settlers and squatters and trespassers came to the area. They would jack logs and lumber out, which they floated down the Chameau River in smaller barges. And then when they got it to Chameau Bay, they would group them into huge floes. and then they would take them out around the Cape, at the point of the Cape, and down past us in the St. Lawrence River, and all the way to Quebec. Then shortly behind the illegal trade became the trappers and the traders. But all of your first inhabitants of the settlement were really a rough crowd. The smuggling of potash, which is wood ash, led to the first road, which was established from Brownville into Catfish Falls, crossing below the creek, not above, or the falls, crossing below the falls, down in the rapids, then went up through Clayton Center and finally into French Creek. That road, many of you still travel. It's a township road, Route 10, and as you go out the other way past Depauville, it's County Route 54. And that illegal smuggling route has become our highway. The first pioneers that came to work the land and build and stay came in 1816. And they were New Englanders of stout stock. They were heading west. It's hard to envision. We sit here, they were leaving Vermont and some of the other areas to head west. And as soon as they could get land cleared, they sowed corn and winter wheat. Those were their staples. They would convert that all to powder or flour by your old mortar and pestle style mill until the stone mills were built, which was about 10 years after the initial settlement. So the early rendition of living in Depauville was that with wild pigs in the forest, it was hogs and hounding were the staff of life. Early 1860 records indicate that there were 2 log cabins, a sawmill, and a mortar and pestle mill. That was its origin. Now, in 1817, Stephen Johnson acquired the original mills because the original owner hadn't paid whoever he owed the payment to. He acquired the mills through non-payment. And Stephen took them over. Stephen was a lieutenant in the War of 1812. Now, I'm going to give you a bunch of dates here. There will be a quiz, so you better have a pen and paper. Okay. In 1818, John Smith built the very first stone house. The post office and the diner in Depauville stand on the property where that building stood. In 1820, the first school in the township was built in at Elm Flats. The school still stands on what was known as the Babcock Farm. Today, that's the farm of Tom and Diane Carr. It was skid crosslots. But as you come up 12, if you're coming out of Depauville and you come up, head towards Clayton, you come over the hill, when you get up by the age of most of you out here, the Proven Farm, Snobber's Corners, there's a cemetery back to the right, and that is where the old school stood. For the first year, the school was the church. In 1821, the Free Baptist built the first church up there. Even though the school survived, the church collapsed, but the cemetery is still there. This was, as the Jefferson County records show, this was the first church built in Jefferson County. In 1822, the first postmaster of Catfish Falls was appointed, and the Methodist Episcopal Church was founded, not the church that stands there today. The very first church was a structure about 3 miles south of the village on what many of you may know as the Roman Cardinal Farm. There was a small structure there, and it was on the opposite side where the house is now. It's just this side of Guns Corners. But that was a small structure that the Methodists started in. 1823, the stone house on top of the hill where Rose Reff, who occupies the property, the Norton family built that house, and as is evident, it still stands. In 1823, Anson and Messer Fowler started a trading post in Depauville. I make mention of their name because the Methodist Church here will recognize Maria Fowler. There's a placard in the church in her memory that her daughter Nettie presented years later. granddaughter, Nettie. Nettie, her parents died young, and so she and her grandparents moved to Clayton, the village. She grew up with her grandparents. She was schooled early in the school in Depauville. She married, ready, Cyrus McCormick, the inventor of the Reaper. He was her senior by quite a few years, but they married and had children, and she assisted him in his business until his children began to be of age to take over. So she left the area, came back to visit, and in one of those times she made the presentation to the Methodist Church. They were avid church people. Most of your early settlers were very church-oriented. The first stone mills, well, the grist mill was built in 1824. The very first one was destroyed by fire in 1851, but rebuilt to the exact same dimension and style. The first stone store was built, a mercantile business. That is the stone store that's in the, I call it downtown Depauville. It's right. I grew up on the one corner, so man, I grew up downtown. But anyway, the stone store still stands there too. In 1825, the first public school was built, and the gray building, which stands up behind the church, is recognized as one of the oldest stone schoolhouses still standing in Jefferson County. In 1827, Catfish Falls became the Depauville Post Office. I know the post offices in the beginning. To be a postmaster was an appointed position. You didn't take a civil service test. And so if you were a store owner, you could apply, and depending on your politics many times, you were awarded the position as postmaster. So the early post offices in Depauville went from store to store. Sometimes they were a year or two, and it was moved because the politics changed. You may be a Republican under a certain president or a certain governor, and you could hold that position for 10, 12 years. But if the politics changed, you may have that position 2 years. So, in 1830, the first dam was built with a log bridge. The dam was needed for water to start to back up water power and create a mill pond. Besides, they needed a spot to make a crossing, so they built they put the dam in and put the log bridge over top of it. Now, I have to point out here, this was an irony to me, that as they deforested the countryside to make farmland, to harvest the lumber, the water table diminishes. So what was more prevalent water and a larger river, and growing up, if we went down Chameau River in a 20-foot boat, we thought we occupied practically the whole river. I would point out ahead of schedule that they built an 85-foot schooner with a 16-foot beam and navigated it, and had multiple shipping vessels on that lower, we still call it creek, but it was known as Chameau River at the time. So the water diminished. Therefore, the water from above the creek was known as Catfish Creek, soon to be Depauville Creek. But the water level was dropping to the point where in the summer, they were having trouble grinding grain in mill, in the grist mill, so they put a dam up to create sluiceways that they could run the water wheels off of. To me, that was an irony that as you deforested, you lost water. It almost would have seemed to me like the trees were sucking up all the water, and it would have created the opposite effect. But anyway, I digress. The book, here's the first official plug. The book, The Changing Years, has much more information on the early settlers, the families that were involved, the German immigration of 1840, the names that we hear from that immigration, early shipping, and the various businesses. So, buy a book and read more about it. Told you I'm unscrupulous with this. In 1835, 1835, Depauville Union Society, which we know more affectionately as the Old Stone Church, was built with a very generous donation from Mr. Depauville. And that church has changed names and affiliation multiple times. It was originally a union church open to any church society. In 1840, as I mentioned already, the German pioneers came, primarily originally selling in what we in the township would recognize as the Dutch Gap world. They had a Lutheran church there, which no longer, once upon a time, about 25 years ago, you could find part of the foundation. But the cemetery is still up there. It was said that it was to have been the first church to have decorated a Christmas tree in Jefferson County. Of course, the decorating of the tree was a very German tradition at the beginning. In 1851, the Methodist Episcopal Church that still stands was built. And that's at the big white church as you drive through the village. In 1870, the second story was added to the Depauville School, which we always call Depauville. In the villages was known, and if you attended it, it was known as Depauville Hillside Academy. And there was grades 1 to 8 there. The schoolhouse remained open until 1943, and then, as it was known, District 6 consolidated with the Clayton Central School System. And they closed it down, only to end up rebuilding a small brick school on Caroline Street, and that went from grades 1 to 6. Well, we had such teachers as Mrs. Kemmis, right there. And in 1867, the Depauville Steamboat Company, does that sound impressive? And I spoke of the schooner that they built a schooner with sail that was 85 foot long and 16 foot deep. That was their largest vessel. There was shipping on Chameau River until 1909. The last vessel that sailed that was a steam-powered tug that they called the Little Mac, and it pushed basically a barge back and forth. It would bring material in for the retailers, and it would take hay and other products out to market, especially to Chameau, where they could meet up with the railroad and ship it out on the railroad. Probably the greatest thing that the Little Mac was known for, besides the shipping, was the 1909 baseball team champions, and they were the North Country champions. It was Depauville's baseball team. Growing up, I never saw a baseball team in Depauville. So I'm going to stop and do a recap here, and hit some of the high points to just kind of discuss what Depauville by 1878 looked like. You had 4 major mercantile stores. Some were a single level with grange halls above them. A couple of them, they occupied both floors. The stone store that some of you would remember as the Eckert store, that was a mini mall in the early days, basically. The post office was there. There was a bank branch there. He ran his store. Upstairs, they ran all kinds of clothing, and as of 20 years ago, if you went upstairs, they had painted the style of the day on the walls, and that was still visible. Then there was a tailor and a millinery store there, and for the sake of the customer, they ran a grocery cart around the community, so there was an attached garage there. Then also, in the store business of the day, and with their small meat market that they were running out of the back, they had to have an ice house that also sat on the property. So by the time you had all the buildings stuck together, it began to look about like a mini mall.
Where was that, Dean, again?
The stone store, if you go right downtown Depauville, there's it's a residence today, a private residence today that stands right on the corner of Carolyn and Stephanie in the DeVito House. I don't know who owns it now. So you had the 4 stores, 3 blacksmith and wagon shops, 2 hotels, the Riverside Hotel and the Grabber, 2 churches, the school through 8th grade, 2 shoe stores, a tailor shop and a millinery, a sawmill, a grist mill, the butter and cheese factory, the post office and telegraph office, 2 resident physicians, 2 resident ministers, 1 dentist, 2 justice of the peace, and life was large in that you had the Grange and your Masons, and a few years later you had the Dramatic Club, the Cornet Band, your church organization groups, the Eastern Stars Women with the first chapter in Jefferson County. You had other lodges, and it was a community of about a little better than 400 people, plus your farmers outside the community. Also, there was a very active temperance society there for a while, so there might have been 2 hotels, but the temperance society was raising cane. That was the community, and that was in 1878 that the history recorded that population. Until about the early 1900s, she did well as a community. She did well, served her people well, and the people served her. The first thing that became part of the death throes of the village was when the railroad came to the North Country. A major line went through Brownville, through Chemung to Cape Vincent, and the other one came through Lafargeville and into Clayton and Depauville, even though she was 6 miles from all surrounding, which was her early claim to fame. She was 7 miles from Lafargeville, 6.5 miles to Chemung, 7 miles to Clayton, about 8 miles to Stone Mills, and so she was the hub of a wheel in a day, as well as having that good water power for quite a few years. But the railroad was a first strike blow to it. The second thing to begin playing after the turn of the century was the automobile came to town. And so where you used to have to go to a local community and acquire everything because you were going in a buckboard or a buggy, you now could get in a car. And what took you as long to come in from some of the countryside to get to Depauville by horse, you could now get to Watertown and over Clayton, which by this time, Clayton, with the railroad coming in, it swung in farther than Depauville. Depauville's early heyday was probably, where she might have been larger, was up until just about the time that shortly after the township was signed in 1833. Your first postmaster, town supervisor to the township of Clayton was from Depauville, Mr. Plum. He was in the Clayton Center. They had a meeting in the stone building that stands there. Most of us would call it the Greystone Inn at this point. They had a meeting to create the township, and he was part of that meeting and sworn in as the first town supervisor. But I get ahead of myself. The next thing after vehicles that added to it is in 1916, poles were put in the village for electricity to come to town, which meant that electricity was coming to town, outside the town. And so, where they needed water power before, they no longer needed the water power the same way. They could plug into electricity and run any mills or engines that they needed to run. I remember going into the old shop. We weren't supposed to be in it. The old sawmill. When we went into the old mill, the wheel had deteriorated by the time I was a kid. But there was the place where the wheel stood, and then there was a shaft that ran right through the building. I got to remember to keep my arms down. And the shaft ran through the building and out of the building and over into what was the finish shop. And in the finish shop, the shaft ran overhead, and there was all these belts. And the belts ran different small saws, sanders, whatever they needed to run out of the shop. But that was originally, all of that assembly was run off the water power from the wheel. And then, of course, as electricity company wasn't needed. The other thing that was a death blow to the community was she experienced two bad fires. The fire of 1906 burned down the entire business block. So if you are familiar with the village law, that included the grist mill, that stood on the falls, that included the A.D. Lau store, which the Village Beauty Parlor stands last. My brother's residence is there now. The Masonic Hall, where the pavilion is, that there was a store there, the Charles Door store, that burned to the ground. The dentist office burnt to the ground. The first White Hotel burnt to the ground, and the Weatherhorn House burnt to the ground. The Gonseth block, John Gonseth, first started in Depauville. He was a harness maker, and but he bought a store, ran it for a year, decided he preferred the harness business, and when he sold the store, he was going to run a harness business out of the side, a little building that was attached to the side, but Mr. Herberger came and built a harness shop, and so John Gonseth sold all his holdings in Depauville and moved right down here on Riverside Drive, and ran his harness shop on Riverside Drive.
Was he John Hodder's?
John Hodder's grandfather.
Okay.
And that business that he had, the building he had, Gonseth block, some of you will remember McFarland's ran it as a store for years. Rick Young's owned it as a private residence until it was burnt. It burned quite a few years back now. And then the second fire of 1921 started from the chimney of the cheese factory, which if you drive through town today, the cheese factory then stood where KMR Tire is today, across from the small mini mart. It started with the fire started there, ashes from the chimney, banged on the roof, ignited the cheese factory, and it was a very bad wind that day, and it blew it right down under Buffalo, is what most of you would know it as. And the Grabber Hotel was across the road. It was a huge hotel. Upstairs rooms, a lot went on there. They had horse sheds and carriage sheds in the back, and above the shed was a ballroom and stage so that they could put on productions and have dances. And it was a big building, occupied a lot of property there. Well, that was lost. The original town hall was across the road from that. That was lost, as well as, don't quote me here, I think it was 9 residents and other outbuildings were lost. When the fire was done at the end of the day, there were 2 very small houses that had survived. One of those, the wind did it a favor. The other one, they took their feather ticks and mattresses and threw them on the roof and saturated them in water. And they were able to survive the blaze that took out. Watertown they telegraphed Watertown that they needed their fire company that was in existence. They came, and I'm impressed with this. In a record 35 minutes, they made it from Watertown to fight the fire. Town of Clayton Fire Department was called. And they had an old wagon that had their hoses and ladders and other attachments. And they pulled it with an old truck tractor. Well, there was a bit of an oversight on how much gas it had. And it made it as far as 1 mile out of Depauville.
Oh, no.
Which is, we call Province Corners.
Right.
They rounded that corner and ran out of gas. So the fire chief from Watertown sent word that they needed manpower and hoses, but whoever the gentleman was in charge of the day said, I'm not releasing anything at this time. They sent and got gas, finally got gas in the vehicle and got the vehicle to fight the fire. But I had to laugh when I read it. Watertown made it 35 minutes, and the misfortune of them running out of gas meant that the closest fire department didn't make it until quite a bit later. But by 5:30, everything was lost.
Right.
So, Glenn Johnrow, if you remember him, was enthralled with the story that he told The family had come to church and just nicely got to the church. The fire truck happened on a Sunday. They got set down, and all at once, both church bells began to ring out, because in those days, in the case of a fire, your church bells were your warning. And he said they came back out of the church building to just see everything burn out on the street. And he recollected, we actually have him on video, in telling the story of being a younger man, but of watching everything burn down before your eyes. It was interesting. One of the things that was most interesting for me was, as he told it, he relived it. You could see that as he told it, he was reliving the emotions, and the feelings, and the images that were there for the day. So at this point, we're going to quit talking about the village and all of its history, because you can get a lot more information if you read more about it. I will talk about a couple of families. One that you can't tell in the history of Depauville without talking about is the Sternberg family. In 1833, Archibald Sternberg, he was German, but he came a little bit before the big German immigration. He walked 150 miles from Montgomery County to the southernmost part of Panay Square, which we that live out in that neck of the woods would recognize Reynolds Corners. He acquired 150 acres of woodland. I kind of thought that was interesting. Must be every mile that he walked, he figured he needed an acre for every mile that he walked. Returned home to Montgomery County to move his wife, 4 children, his mother, his brother, and 2 sisters, and all their personal belongings in an ox cart to this new location. He had to move the mother and the rest of the family because his father had died, and he became the provider for the family. Archibald and his wife had 11 children, all total 3 sets of twins. Elias was one of the sons. In 1882, he secured 25 acres of prime forest and the title to the sawmill property in the village. And with his sons, Ed and Fred, he developed the lumber and shingle and cheese box business that most of us would recognize from the Sternberg brothers. Edwin died at 27 years of age. I can't imagine running a sawmill and cutting your own lumber and hauling it out. It doesn't tell what he died of, but if you put 2 and 2 together, there probably was an accident of some sort that he died at 27. And Fred, the brother, took full control of the business. The sawmill in the early days saw day and night, and in the winter months, they had 6 teams for logging wood, felled timber out of the woods. I had talked with Marcus, who was the son of Frederick. He was the postmaster in Depauville for years. He and his brother ran a hardware store and appliance business in their latter life. We were talking one time, and he had a picture on the wall. I asked him about the picture of the father's business, and he began to tell many stories. I get off the school bus, and many times I got stuck at staying at the post office and hardware store to listen to Ed or Marcus tell stories, grand stories of the day. But he would tell his father would take the team and they would hook up to a skid of logs, and if they had to drag that out on open water, or sometimes it was just as easy, most of the time, it was just as easy to get it to the waterway and then skid it down the waterways, either up Schmo River or down Depauville Creek. But he told that if there was 2 inches of ice, his father would put a team on that water. And he said it would roll. But once you got the team on it, you stayed in motion. You did not stop. Now occasionally, they'd lose a team to the ice. And they would have to work diligently just to get the horses back out of the water. But 2 inches of ice, and you would put the weight of a team of horses and a log skin on it, just to get it back to the lumber yard. Cheese boxes that they made were made out of 2 different types of wood. Elm was used for Limburger, and basswood was used for good old Yankee cheddar cheese. Fred's sons, Ed and Marcus, worked with their father until 1925 they took over the management of the business themselves. I also have to point out that they had a trucking business along with this, and so I got to get the library, the Depauville library, more focused on putting something on so that you can view it. But we have this wonderful picture of an old 1920 vintage flatbed truck, and they have that thing so stacked with cheese crates that it's probably 6 feet above the cab of the truck, and it was a log bed truck. But the cheese box became their claim to fame later. So then they had to run them all over the place. And so what most of you remember is the general store in Depauville was originally their trucking business. Then when they got out of it, there was a garage for their trucks. When they got out of that, they went into the hardware and appliance business. The demand, we would think that there was probably no demand for cheese boxes, or little demand for cheese boxes, but the demand in the 1940s with the war in Europe meant with meat rationings in the United Kingdom, the demand increased. And so during the war, the production of cheese boxes alone went from 50,000 to 75,000 boxes. At that time, they also started production of a wooden fruit crate, which we recognize as an apple crate. There was better circulation than a bushel basket, so that the apples kept better. Sternberg Brothers was the only surviving box factory in Jefferson County during the war movement. But the trade fell out, after the war the trade fell off, and they eventually, there wasn't any business, so they got out of it and went to hardware and appliances. When Ed and Marcus took over the business in 1925, the reason for that was that their father, Fred Sternberg, had become the supervisor of the town of Clayton. I have to point out that the estate of Andy Zack has the last existing Sternberg's cheese box in Jefferson County, as far as I'm aware of. I don't know of anybody else that owns one, but Andy had worked for them. And one time when I gave a presentation, he came in and bought the cheese box on the table. And so, of course, Andy's no longer with us, so therefore, I don't know where the box is at all. I talked a little bit about the Fowler family coming. They came in 1820. They set up an ashery, and they ran a trading store. They carried dry goods, cut to length for the woman's choosing, muslin for sheets, sewing supplies, and this was the most peculiar list of stuff in the trade. But they carried indigo and other dyes, dictionaries, grammars, spellers, ink powder, suspenders, combs, spectacles, spoons, and snuff. They would deliver in the wintertime when transportation was more difficult for the farmers because of the demand for wood ash, potash, which came mostly from when they felled the lumber, they would burn the stumps up. And then, or even in their homes, they created a lot of wood ash. Well, wood ash was a commodity that they actually traded. It was as good as cash. So in the winter when transportation was harder, the Fowler family would go out in sleighs and take the merchandise out that the people may be interested in. They would trade for the wood ashes, bring it back, put the wood ashes in a vat, add hot to warm water to it, and then let it work, and the finished product was live. And so, and they early days of the trading centers, they traded for wood ash. It was as good as cash. They also traded for grain or potash itself. Messerfaller was kicked in the head by one of his not so pleasant horses and died of his injury. And Mrs. Fowler died young, so as I had already pointed out, Nettie Fowler went to live with her grandparents and they moved to Clayton. And then, as I also mentioned, she married Cyrus McCormick and they went west. That brings us to a 1840 German immigration. It was a pretty heavy German immigration at that time. Names like Bolz, Dorr, Hawes, Holler, Diefendorf, Huxmeyer, Linkenfelter, Grabber, Wetterhorn, Snauber, Sauerwein, Leiterman, and even though Danewald didn't come for about 50 years later, if I didn't throw Great Grandpa Danewald's name out there, I would be amiss. So, they all brought names that were now recognized in their school systems and in the businesses. They were very efficient farmers and very efficient in business. And so what they brought to the Depauville community was very productive business people. And through the history, which is in this little book, you will read many times of them being store owners. Gloria ducked out on this, but her grandparents, the Huxmeyers, ran the store for years, and one of the big mercantile stores. So it's kind of in, if we stop and think of Mary, the Rymans are very prodigious business people, but then she also had the Huxmeyer side. So it's no wonder Rymans runs like it runs. So, or Hamans. The Germans brought with them very stout backs and good character, as well as their thrift and industry and perseverance to the community. There are many stories of their individual crossing. In particular, I like the one, they loaded their wagon in Germany and put it on the vessel that brought them here. They unloaded it in New York City, shipped it up the Hudson to Albany, put it on the canal boats to Utica, unloaded it in Utica, and they drive her to get them through the wild wilderness and trackless woods, and then finally landed in, of all places, just outside of Depauville. Another one that was an interesting story was the Hawes family. He kept Heinrich Hawes, sounds German, doesn't it? He kept a great diary, and amongst the things that they brought was his piano. He was a music professor, and he brought the piano from Germany all the way to it ended up in the Lutheran church that was between Depauville and Hartford. Their story was a little bit more tragic. They spent around 2 months at sea. They had a baby born at sea, but they lost 2 children at sea. So, some of the stories of what they endured to get here are unbelievable. And I think, if I can digress a little, we have to stop and realize the fortitude of the people that tamed the wilderness, that made the communities, that made the nation that we are. There was no willy-nilly, there was no quitting and returning. In many cases, they had nothing to return to. So, I know in the case of my grandfather, Danewald, when he came with his mother and sister, they fled Germany. They fled out of Darmstadt, Germany, which was in Hessen County. He fled because at that time they were still taking young people as soldiers, and you had no choice. You were part of the Hessen German army, and some of the counties would take it that wages, but the owner of the county that owned that district, he would hire them out as mercenary soldiers. Our Revolutionary War, the English hired the Germans as mercenary armies, and he would hire them out, and he became very rich off it. But they had no choice. That's on the case of Riverdale. His father had been an Hessian soldier, and he was killed. And so when Grandma remarried, and they came to this country, she remarried a man who had 4 sons, and she had a son, and it was of their opinion that they weren't going to be involuntary Hessian soldiers. So some of them that came, there was no going back. There just was no return to go. They either sold everything and had nothing to return to, or they didn't want to go back to what they had been living. So there are some marvelous stories of their crossings and comings. The other thing I want to point out is, because then I got to wrap it up, extend to women equal and civil and political rights with men. Those women were Eleanor Vincent, Lydia Williams, Lydia Osborne, Susan Ormsby, Amy Ormsby, and Anna Bishop. They attended the state capitol to submit their petition. Their petition was rejected. But 2 years later, the women's rights advocates, one of which we all recognize was Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Stanton, with several others, met at the 1848 Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, and at this time, their declaration was recognized. There is a historical marker stating that these 6 women were the first petition in New York State history, and that is up. Well, if you know where the Bob Meeks farm is, it's just, if you're headed towards Watertown, it's just past the Bob Meeks farm. There's a road, it used to be a thoroughfare road, and on the other end is recognized as Vincent Road. And if that follows all the way through, and it comes out of what used to be Mark Stevens' farm. I can't think of who owns it now. Morris Felt owns it. And it sits on that corner because, of course, one of the women that was on the petition was Eleanor Vincent. Most of these women, 4 of these women, actually lived over in what they call Liberty Pole. That would be, most of you know where the Weather Auto Farm is now. It's on County Route 5. There were a cluster of them that Lydia Ormsby, or Osborne, was the wife of a minister. And anyways, they went down and they were one of the first groups to petition, at least for New York State. Now, I will briefly name some of the names and tell why, but I'm not going through the list. I've already mentioned James Plum was the first town supervisor when the town was, Hubble Fox was the first town supervisor in 1833 when she became a township. James Plum was another one. All in all, out of Depauville's community, there have been 10 men that have served as town supervisors in the history of the township. Some of them served as, one man, Everett Vincent, served as the town justice, Jefferson County Sheriff, town supervisor, and a state assemblyman. There were also, I think it's 4 other that went on to become state assemblymen. As far as doctors to the community, 2 out of 10 doctors stayed within the Hamlet of Depauville's history. But she had 10 resident doctors, and most of them ended up relocating one place. One man went back to New York City. A couple of them that you would recognize the name is Dr. William Frame, moved to Clayton and set up his business. And one that you're all going to recognize and tell a story about would be Dr. Bill Bell. He started in Depauville and eventually moved his business to Clayton. So, as far as I close on that note, as Depauville's influence within the township would have been that her people have influenced the town government in the early years. One of the doctors, I was totally blown out of the water that one of the early doctors, his territory went from Brownville. He would come to Clayton and take a boat to Gananoque. And so living in Depauville, and he stayed in Depauville because, again, of that wagon wheel effect, it was centrally located for him to leave there and go to Lafargeville or Chenal or into Canada or Omar or wherever. But that, aside from during Prohibition, the town of Clayton had a special permit to sell alcohol in Jefferson County, and that meant that Depauville's hotels. I interviewed an older lady, Ola Dwyer, when we were writing the original book, and Ola said that on Saturday nights you couldn't get down the streets of Depauville because everybody came to town to get alcohol, basically. So
Interesting.
that would be her influence, is the town government and doctors, and I guess she's always been a place for people to go and play. So, thank you.
Just want to open up, does anybody have any dying questions that they want to ask?
Yeah. Definitely dying question, because this guy talks too long.
I have a question. Was there any French influence early on in trading with Native Americans in Depauville?
I think some of those early settlers that came that were French, there's a couple that were French by name, and I believe that they kind of started things.
Was it an active trading area?
Well, it was very active as a trading post with the original Indian nations. And then, like when Anson and Messer came, they set up a trading post, but that was primarily to the trappers, traders, and early settlers. The French history of the area, of course, encompasses the whole. I mean, you can't, I always like to say you can't sling a dead cat without hitting the French name in our area, but because Lorraine and DePaul and Cape Vincent and New Orleans, and sort of Lafarge, I just, right now off the top of my head, I can't even think about them. But they're very proud of the countryside. You're from French influence. The only one that seems to remember and really play into it is Cape Vincent. They played up with their French festival. So.
All right. Well, Dean, thank you very much. I got 2 certificates. One for you to give to the Depauville Free Library, and then one that you can put in your scrapbook with your other history things. But thank you today for.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you all for supporting History at Noon, 60th centennial year, and I wish you well on this beautiful fall day. Thank you.